Hey, welcome back. In this biology lesson, we'll be going over the entire process of photosynthesis from beginning to end. So, buckle up. Now, before we discuss anything, let's just talk about what goes into photosynthesis. What is the point? Why do plants photosynthesize? So, plants require carbon dioxide and water. Those are the reactants of photosynthesis. Now, in a chemical reaction, reactants are transformed into new substances. What do we get out of photosynthesis? Oxygen gas, as basically a waste product, is produced, and carbohydrates. Now, in reality, at the end of what's called the Calvin cycle, we get this specific 3-carbon molecule that can be used for anything, almost anything that the plant needs. But we're focusing on energy. So we are going to be discussing how plants use the Calvin cycle to make glucose or carbohydrates in general. And then light energy has to be absorbed or used to initiate this entire process. So be thinking about how we're going to transform water and carbon dioxide into sugars and oxygen throughout. So to begin with, energy from the sun. The sun emits all kinds of electromagnetic radiation. There's radio waves and ultraviolet waves and infrared and gamma X-ray, but also visible light. So why are plants green? Well, why is anything green? Why is anything the color that it is? Objects are the color that they are because that wavelength is what they fail to absorb. So whatever is reflected back to us, that is the color we see. Now, there are some weird exceptions to that I'm not going to get into. You can look them up. There are two kinds of chlorophyll, A and B. They don't absorb all wavelengths equally, but neither of them absorb hardly any green whatsoever. So that is really why leaves on plants are green. Now, they do change color, though. That's because chlorophyll is not the only pigment. It's just by far the most common pigment. There are carotenoids and anthocyanins within the majority of plants as well. These reflect yellow to orange and reddish wavelengths. Now, the reason that the leaves change color in the fall is because as the leaf shuts down, chlorophyll shuts down first for whatever reason. Carotenoids and anthocyanins continue absorbing certain wavelengths but reflecting the reds and yellows and oranges. So for a brief while, we get to see those carotenoid and anthocyanin pigments, which are always there, just usually covered up by the more common chlorophyll. So here's our spectrum or part of the spectrum of electromagnetic radiation. And here's a graph of chlorophyll, or what chlorophyll absorbs. So chlorophyll B is very good at absorbing blue. Chlorophyll A really isn't, but it's very good at absorbing violet and red. So we look at all the overlap, but we see that they really fail to absorb any green, so instead they reflect it. And here's an excellent depiction of cell specialization. These are leaf cells, and the leaf, its job is to do the light-dependent reaction, parts of photosynthesis. I guess technically it does the Calvin cycle as well. But these cells are jam-packed with really nothing but chloroplast, the photosynthetic organelle. And that's where we go to next. So this gets a little bit complicated. Within the chloroplast, there are these other membranous structures called thylakoids. Now, the thylakoid has a membrane, and that's where the chlorophyll pigment is located. That's where it's concentrated. That inner membrane of the mitochondria is truly where the light absorption takes place. In prokaryotes that photosynthesize, cyanobacteria, they have chlorophyll embedded within their cell membrane. Prokaryotes don't have organelles except for ribosomes. I take a stack of thylakoids, that's called a granum. Not terribly interested in that, it's just some vocabulary. But there's also empty space within the chloroplast. So that's called the stroma, and that is where the second half, we can sort of call it, of photosynthesis takes place. So, little preview. here. What is going on is within that thylakoid membrane, where the chlorophyll is, light energy is absorbed. And that light energy is used to take the water molecule and it breaks it in half, splits the hydrogen from the oxygen. It also separates the electrons from the hydrogen atoms. Those electrons move down what's called an electron transport chain, and that is used to build up potential energy in order to do some work, which we will jump into very shortly here. So here's a simplified model of a chloroplast organelle, and there's the thylakoid membranes, empty space is the stroma. We don't see the chlorophyll, but it's embedded within that membrane. So, those electrons that I just mentioned, we can think of them as being heated up by the sunlight, and that energy that's given to them, well, that's used to do work. What is the definition of energy? It's the capacity to do work. So what these electrons have to do is they have to be transported by a molecule. And we call that an electron carrier. And its name is NADP+. It stands for nicotine amide, dinucleotide phosphate, something like that. Just call it NADP+. That plus indicates that it has a positive charge. So it's going to add 2 electrons, which are negatively charged, and a positively charged hydrogen ion. That brings it to neutral, and it becomes NADPH at this point. This molecule, the electron carrier, it basically, we transfer energy that it was absorbed by electrons and hydrogen ions from sunlight, add that absorbed energy to NADP+, turn it into NADPH. NADPH is a molecule that helps to synthesize larger carbon molecules from CO2. CO2 is a really small molecule. Glucose is a much larger molecule. So, in order to build large molecules, we need energy, and we don't use sunlight. Plants don't use sunlight directly to make carbohydrates. They use it indirectly. The light energy is absorbed by this molecule, and then that molecule lends that energy to a different process called the Calvin cycle, which makes carbohydrates. We'll get into more detail with that soon. Here is the overview or the overall equation for photosynthesis. Now, in reality, photosynthesis is, I don't know how many different chemical reactions, probably a few dozen chemical reactions, but it occurs more or less in 2 stages. So we sort of went over this, but the carbon dioxide specifically is used to build up carbohydrates. The water is used it's the source for the hydrogen and the electrons to make the NADPH, which makes the carbohydrates. It's also the source of the oxygen. So when the water molecule is split, the O in H2O is just taken out of the chloroplast. And that's, sorry I went too far, but that's the bottom thing right here. So in simplest terms, that is what all of the reactants and products do. That's the origin for the products, and that's how the reactants are used. So, the first part, I've already discussed both of these stages, but more details. The light-dependent reaction. What happens is, during the day, within the thylakoid membrane, light energy is absorbed, and 2 basic things happen. NADPH is made, the water molecules split, hydrogen, electrons, plus the oxygen. NADPH is made, and oxygen gas is released as a waste product. Those are the 2 basic things that are accomplished. So understand that. Now here are the details. This is called the electron transport chain. These large molecules are called photosystems. Really, all you need to understand is that is where the light energy is absorbed. That's where the chlorophyll are located. And there's 2 photosystems. This one's photosystem 2, that one's photosystem 1. So, what's going on? Water enters, and that light energy that's absorbed here splits the water molecule. There goes oxygen. And as I said, it also splits the electron away from the hydrogen atoms. So that's why we see H+. These are hydrogen ions. And the electrons flow along the membrane of the thylakoid. That's why it's called an electron transport chain. Now, nature doesn't like things to be one-sided. So these hydrogen ions build up on one side of the membrane, but that's not ideal. We want a state of equilibrium to be reached. So these hydrogen ions move across the membrane through a compound called protein structure called ATP synthase. So these hydrogen ions, they basically have potential energy because they have a buildup of charge. So as they move through here, the little bit of energy they have is actually used to create small amounts of ATP, which is nice. ATP is going to be used next to also help make glucose and other organic compounds. Now, what happens with that hydrogen ion? Well, it's recombined with the electron it was separated from and NADP+ to make NADPH. Now, ATP and NADPH go off to the Calvin cycle, which is next. And here's an even simpler version of this. Water goes in, light comes in, ADP comes in, NADP+ comes in. They leave as NADPH and ATP, and oxygen is released. So, next is the Calvin cycle. This can take place in the dark. Geographically speaking, it takes place in the stroma, the empty-ish regions of the chloroplast. So, two main things happen here. First is 6 carbon dioxide molecules, also 6 water molecules. Usually, your book will skip that detail, but it is also true that you need water to do this. Those are combined together to create glucose. We need water because CO2 has no hydrogen, water does, and glucose has hydrogen. So, NADPH and ATP, their energy is used to build the glucose, and then those molecules are recycled. We take their energy away. The energy from ATP is released by breaking off one of those phosphate groups, and the energy from NADPH is released from removing the hydrogen and extra electrons. Here is now the Calvin cycle is really complicated. We can make it look way more complicated than this. All these molecules have names. There's ribulose 1,5-biphosphate, and then there's an enzyme called Rubisco. It's not super important that you know exactly what these molecules are because this isn't organic chemistry. Here's what happens. Carbon dioxide and water come in. They combine with a pre-existing 5-carbon molecule to build up a series of 3-carbon molecules. Then, again, the energy that we created during the light-dependent reaction is used we only end up taking some of them out. So again, this recycles material as well. But that creates these 2 3-carbon molecules. Those 2 3-carbon molecules are called 3-phosphoglycerate. So it's a 3-carbon molecule with a phosphate group added to it. Those can be used to make many other molecules, but we're focusing on glucose because we're focusing on carbohydrates and energy. And here's the simplified version of that as well. Carbon dioxide goes in. They're not including water, but we need water as well. And then the energy molecules are used to build these sugars, and then they are recycled. And that actually takes us to the end of photosynthesis. Now, there are more details about that you should probably read about and look into, but I didn't want to make this video 30 minutes long. Next time you join me, we'll be discussing fermentation. So, thank you for watching.